In the summer of 1943, Winston Churchill approved the construction of an aircraft carrier 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, displacing 2.2 million tons. It was to be built out of ice. That is usually where the story stops. A wartime absurdity. A footnote about desperate men and a bad idea. But the ice was not the bad idea. The ice worked. Engineers built a prototype, and it sat in a Canadian lake refusing to melt, summer after summer, long after the war had moved on without it. The project died for a reason almost nobody repeats. To keep the ship frozen, it needed a refrigeration plant. And the steel required to build that refrigeration plant came out greater than the steel required to simply build the carrier out of steel. The solution consumed more of the exact resource it existed to save. This is the story of how a good idea produced that result. And of why, by the time it was approved, it no longer mattered. To understand why anyone took this seriously, you have to understand what the North Atlantic looked like in 1942. Britain imported almost everything. Food, fuel, ore, aircraft, ammunition. All of it crossed the Atlantic in convoys, and German submarines were sinking those convoys faster than the shipyards could replace them. In 1942 alone, Allied losses ran past 1,600 ships. Air cover was the answer, and everyone knew it. An aircraft overhead forces a submarine to dive, and a submerged submarine is slow. It cannot keep pace with a convoy. It cannot hunt. It can only wait and watch the ships leave. The problem was geography. Aircraft could fly out from Newfoundland. They could fly out from Iceland and from Northern Ireland. But in the middle of the ocean lay a stretch of water that no land-based aircraft could reach from any shore, roughly 300 miles across. The crews called it the Black Pit. Everything that entered it did so alone. And the obvious fix, more aircraft carriers, ran straight into the second constraint of the war. Every carrier was a claim on steel, on slipways, and on the same welders who were building destroyers and merchant hulls. Britain did not have spare steel. Nobody did. So combined operations went looking for a carrier that could be built without any. Geoffrey Pyke was a journalist. He had talked his way into Berlin as a correspondent in the First World War, been caught, been interned, and escaped on foot into the Netherlands. He had made a fortune on the London Metal Exchange, spent it founding an experimental school, and then lost every penny of it speculating on commodities. By 1942, he was 48 years old, unemployable in any conventional sense, and working directly for Lord Louis Mountbatten with a job title that amounted to producing ideas. His idea about the Atlantic was far better than its reputation. Pyke did not propose building a ship out of ice. He proposed not building a ship at all. There was, he pointed out, one structural material in the North Atlantic available in effectively unlimited quantity, at no cost, requiring no factory, no slipway and no steel, and it was already floating there. Flatten the top of an iceberg. Land aircraft on it. It is a genuinely good idea. It is also, exactly as stated, impossible. And the reason why is the most important engineering in this story. Ice is not a bad structural material. In compression it is respectable. A column of ice will carry a serious load without complaint. Ice fails in two other ways. The first is tension. Ice is brittle. Press on it and it holds. Pull on it or bend it and it cracks, and once a crack starts in ice, there is nothing inside frozen water to stop it. It runs the whole way. This matters because a ship is a beam. It floats on waves that support it in some places and not in others, so along its length a hull is constantly being bent. A 2,000-foot hull of pure ice in an Atlantic swell does not sink. It snaps. The second failure is stranger. Ice creeps. Under a load that never changes, ice does not simply hold or break. It slowly flows like extremely cold glass. This is not a defect of badly made ice. It is what ice is, and it is the reason glaciers move. A ship built of it would not need to be attacked. Left alone in perfect weather, under nothing but its own weight, it would gradually sag out of shape. So Pyke's iceberg dies on the second page of calculations. Unless somebody changes what ice is. Somebody did. The work happened in a cold room 20 degrees below zero, in the basement of Smithfield Meat Market in London, carried out by a young Austrian refugee named Max Pykrete. 20 years later, he would win a Nobel Prize for working out the structure of hemoglobin. In 1942, he was freezing blocks of wet sawdust. What came out of that meat locker was a mixture of 14% wood pulp and 86% water, frozen solid. It was named a Pykrete after Pyke. The wood fibers do something ice cannot do alone. When a crack starts, the fibers bridge it and hold the two faces together, so the crack has to break every fiber individually instead of running free. It is the same principle as reinforcing concrete with steel, and it produces the same transformation. A brittle material becomes a tough one. In tension, a Pykrete tested roughly 4 times stronger than plain ice. It also melted far more slowly, because as the surface ice retreated, the wood pulp left behind formed a soggy insulating blanket over everything underneath. And it was almost free. There is a famous story about what happened next. At the Quebec Conference in August 1943, in front of the Allied Chiefs of Staff, Mountbatten is said to have drawn his service pistol, shot a block of ordinary ice, which shattered, and then shot a block of a Pykrete, from which the bullet ricocheted and tore the trouser leg of an American admiral. It is a wonderful story. It is also told several different ways by several different people, and some versions do not involve Mountbatten at all. Something like it probably happened. The precise version you have heard is probably wrong. What is certain is the outcome. Churchill and Roosevelt were convinced, and Habakkuk was given top priority. And then the design met the ocean. The iceberg disappeared almost immediately. Natural bergs are the wrong shape, they are unevenly strong, and they roll without warning. The ship would have to be built in a shipyard out of manufactured a Pykrete, which meant it was no longer free. Then creep came back. A Pykrete resists creep better than ice, but it does not abolish it, and 2.2 million tons applies a great deal of sustained load. The fix was to keep the interior cold and stiff, which meant a refrigeration system, which meant running ducting through the entire hull. Thousands of miles of steel piping carrying chilled brine. Then the hull thickness climbed to 40 feet to carry the loads. Then propulsion. You cannot run a drive shaft through a frozen hull, because a warm shaft in an ice hull bores its own tunnel. So the motors were moved outside, into 26 separate nacelles hung off the sides of the ship. Then speed. 26 electric motors producing 33,000 horsepower moved 2.2 million tons at 6 knots. That is slower than the convoys it was built to protect. And it matters more than it sounds, because a carrier launches aircraft by turning into the wind and adding its own speed to whatever the weather is already providing. Habakkuk had almost nothing to add. Then steering. The original plan was to steer by varying the speed of the motors on each side, the way a tracked vehicle turns. The Royal Navy rejected it and insisted on a rudder. A rudder proportioned to a 2,000-foot hull would have stood over 100 feet high. Nobody ever solved how to mount it. Look at the shape of that sequence. Every solution created the next problem, and almost every problem was answered with steel. A material chosen, specifically because it needed no steel now, required a refrigeration plant, whose steel demand exceeded the steel of a conventional carrier outright. The cost estimate started at £700,000. It passed £2.5 million. That is the fatal compromise, and it is not unique to Habakkuk. It is the ordinary way ambitious engineering dies. Not one catastrophic flaw, but a chain of individually reasonable fixes that walk the design straight back into the constraint it was invented to escape. There is a second reason it died, and it is crueler. While the naval architects were arguing about rudders, the black pit was closing on its own. Long-range bombers carrying extra fuel tanks began flying patrols deep into the gap. Escort carriers, small and cheap and built on merchant hulls, started arriving in numbers. Portugal granted the Allies airfields in the Azores. And in May 1943, after losing dozens of submarines in a single month, the German command withdrew its boats from the North Atlantic altogether. The Black Pit did not close because of Habakkuk. It closed before Habakkuk was ever approved. The demonstration at Quebec, the moment the project was given top priority, happened 3 months after the battle it was designed to win had already been won. The last project meeting was held in December 1943. Habakkuk was, in the language of the file, no longer required. One piece of it was actually built. On Patricia Lake in Jasper, Alberta, a scale model was assembled. 60 feet by 30 feet, 1,000 tons of a Pykrete, held frozen by a single 1-horsepower motor. The labor came from conscientious objectors doing alternative service, and they were never told what they were building. The model worked. That is the part worth sitting with. It floated, it held its shape, and when the project was cancelled and the refrigeration was switched off, it took the better part of 3 Canadian summers to melt. The remains are still down there on the lake bed with a plaque. Habakkuk is filed under wartime lunacy, and the filing is wrong. The material was real and it was measured. The prototype was built and it behaved. The engineering was not fantasy. What killed it was that the answer arrived after the question had expired, carrying a bill that had quietly grown into the thing it was meant to avoid. Which is a far more uncomfortable lesson than a boat made of ice, because feasibility is rarely what kills a mega project. Timing and accounting do. The next one flew exactly once, in 1921, on 9 wings, and came apart over an Italian lake before the day was out.